The sky over Harlow Creek had been threatening since Tuesday. By Thursday night, it delivered. The rain came sideways, hammering the tin roofs of the old farmhouses along Route 9 with the kind of fury that made grown men check their window latches twice and whisper quiet prayers before bed. The creek that gave the town its name, a modest, usually gentle ribbon of water that ran along the eastern edge of Dale Whitford's property, had swollen to nearly 4 times its normal width by 10 o'clock in the evening. By midnight, it was climbing the banks. Lucas Merritt heard it before he saw it. He was sleeping in the small room he rented from Mrs. Patricia Holloway, a 72-year-old widow who charged him $40 a week for a space barely large enough to fit a cot, a dresser, and his worn leather boots standing at attention by the door. The room smelled of cedar and old paper. The window faced east toward the Whitford property.
Quakes.
And when the wind shifted, Lucas could sometimes hear the cattle moving in their sleep, a low, restless sound like the earth itself turning over. That night, the sound that woke him wasn't cattle. It was a calf, high-pitched, desperate, cutting through the drum of rain on the roof with the kind of persistence that Lucas's body recognized before his mind did. He sat up in the dark, blinking. The sound came again, thin, broken, terrified. He pulled on his jeans, his flannel shirt, his boots. He didn't think about whose land it was. He didn't think about much at all. He just moved. The mud outside was deep and cold. It sucked at his boots with every step as he crossed the low wire fence that separated Mrs. Holloway's property from the edge of the Whitford land. The rain hit him immediately, soaking through his flannel in seconds, plastering his brown hair flat against his forehead. He flicked on the small flashlight he'd grabbed from the dresser and swept it across the dark. The beam found the calf in the drainage ditch that ran along the fence line, a narrow channel, normally dry or carrying just a trickle, now surging with brown water that reached Lucas's knees when he dropped down into it. The animal was maybe 3 days old, small and black and white, wedged against a tangle of broken fence posts and debris, its head barely above the surface. Its legs thrashed weakly. Its eyes, caught in the flashlight beam, were wide and white with terror. "Easy," Lucas said, though he knew the calf couldn't hear him over the rain. Easy now, he waded in. The current was stronger than it looked. It pushed against his legs with cold insistence, and the mud beneath his feet gave way in unpredictable patches. He went down on one knee, caught himself with one hand against the bank, and kept moving. The water reached his waist by the time he got to the calf. He tucked the flashlight into his shirt pocket, gripped the animal with both arms, slippery, shaking, its ribs heaving, and hauled it up against his chest. It took 3 attempts to get out of the ditch. On the second, his right boot sank completely, and he had to yank it free with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. On the third, he managed to get one leg up onto the bank, then roll sideways with the calf on top of him, both of them landing in the wet grass, breathing hard. Lucas lay there for a moment, staring up at the black sky, rain falling on his face, the calf's head resting on his chest. He could feel its heartbeat, frantic, too fast, but there you go, he said quietly. There you go. He got up, wrapped the calf as best he could inside his flannel shirt against his chest, and carried it to the nearest structure on the Whitford property, a small equipment shed about 60 yards from the ditch. The door wasn't locked. He pushed inside, found a pile of old burlap sacks in the corner, and laid the calf down on them. He rubbed its legs and sides with the rough fabric until it stopped shaking. He stayed until its breathing slowed to something closer to normal. By the time Lucas walked back through the dark and the rain and the mud to Mrs. Holloway's house, it was nearly 2 in the morning. He peeled off his soaked clothes, dried himself with the single thin towel hanging on the back of the door, and lay down on the cot. He fell asleep within minutes. He did not expect anything in return. He never did. The morning came gray and washed clean, the kind of morning after a storm that smells like wet soil and new starts. Lucas was at the Harlow Creek feed and supply by 7:30. picking up a bag of mineral supplement that Roy Cassidy had asked him to get before the workday started. Roy was one of the 3 small farmers in the area who hired Lucas on a rotating basis. Not enough work from any one of them to make a living, but together, just barely enough. The feed store sat on Main Street, which in Harlow Creek meant a 2-block stretch of brick-fronted buildings. The feed store, a diner called Patsy's, the post office, a hardware store, a small grocery, and the First Methodist Church at the far end, with its white steeple and its hand-painted sign that read, "All are welcome here." On a Friday morning after a hard rain, the street had that particular small-town texture of people stopping to check on neighbors, comparing storm damage, moving slowly and with purpose at the same time. Lucas was loading the mineral supplement into the back of Roy's old truck when he heard Dale Whitford's voice. It was a voice that carried. Dale was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been powerful and had since let that power settle into mass. Broad shoulders gone soft at the edges, a jaw still sharp under a face that had grown ruddy with years of sun and certainty. He owned 1,100 acres east of town, the largest single farm in Harlow Creek County. He had 2 combines, a grain elevator with his name painted on it in black letters 3 feet high, and a reputation for knowing exactly what everything was worth: land, livestock, labor, and people. He was standing in front of Patsy's diner with 2 men Lucas recognized: Bill Sutter, who managed the grain elevator, and a county agricultural inspector named Doane Pritchard, who came through Harlow Creek every few months and always seemed to end up in Dale's pocket somehow. Dale was speaking loudly, gesturing toward the eastern edge of town, and as Lucas turned to look, he realized with a cold drop in his stomach that Dale was talking about him. "Found him this morning in my equipment shed. My ranch hand Carl saw him at 6 when he went to check the south fence. Soaking wet clothes hanging on a nail, the shed door left open, my calf dragged God knows where." "The calf is fine," Lucas said. He hadn't meant to say it that loudly. But the street was quiet enough in that particular way of small towns in early morning, and his voice carried just as far as Dale's. Dale turned. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale gray, flat, assessing. He looked at Lucas the way a man looks at something he's trying to decide whether to step around or step on. "What did you say to me, boy?" Lucas kept his voice even. He was 19 years old, and he had been poor his entire life, which meant he had learned early how to stand still under a heavy gaze without flinching. "I said the calf is fine, Mr. Whitford. I pulled it out of the drainage ditch last night around midnight. It was caught in the debris from the flooding. I put it in your shed to get it warm." The street had gone quiet. Lucas was aware, without looking directly, that people had stopped moving. The door to Patsy's diner was open, and he could see 2 or 3 faces turned toward the window. Old Gerald Marsh, who sat on the bench in front of the post office every morning without fail, had lowered his newspaper. Dale Whitford stared at him for a long moment, then he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was short and dismissive, the sound of a man performing contempt for an audience he knew was watching. "Pulled it out," Dale repeated, turning slightly toward Bill Sutter as he said it, making sure the other man caught the joke. "Boy, that calf was born 3 days ago. It weighs 80 pounds. You're telling me you waded into my drainage ditch in the middle of the night to rescue it?" He paused. "Or you were on my property without permission, and the calf is the story you're going with." The words landed with precision. Lucas felt them the way you feel a hand laid flat and hard against your chest. Not a punch, something worse. A push, a dismissal. "I wasn't stealing anything," Lucas said. "I didn't say stealing." Dale's voice was mild now, almost pleasant, which was more dangerous. "I said trespassing. Though I suppose with someone in your situation," he let the pause stretch, "a man might be looking for any opportunity that presents itself." Someone in your situation. 4 words. Everyone on Main Street understood them perfectly. Lucas Merritt, who rented a room from a widow for $40 a week. Lucas Merritt, whose father had left when he was 11. Lucas Merritt, who worked 3 farms because no one would take him on full-time. Lucas Merritt, who was 19 and poor and did not own a single acre of anything. I have witnesses, Dale continued, his tone settling into the comfortable rhythm of a man who has made a decision. Carl Briggs saw you on my property at 6 this morning. You were on private land without permission. I suggest you stay off Whitford property from now on and count yourself lucky I'm not taking this further. He adjusted his jacket. You can go on back to whatever it is you do. He turned back to Bill Sutter as though Lucas had already ceased to exist. For a moment, Lucas stood completely still on the sidewalk. The mineral supplement bag was in his hands. The morning air smelled like wet asphalt and coffee from the diner. Gerald Marsh had not raised his newspaper back up. The faces in the diner window had not moved. Lucas put the bag in the truck bed. He got in. He drove back to Roy Cassidy's farm without saying another word to anyone. But Harlow Creek had heard every syllable. Roy Cassidy was 54, lean, weathered in the specific way of men who have spent 30 years outdoors and never quite made the money they were hoping for. He had kind eyes and rough hands and a habit of chewing on a toothpick when he was thinking. He was mending a section of fence along his north pasture when Lucas pulled up and got out of the truck. Lucas set the mineral supplement by the gatepost and picked up the fence pliers without being asked. Roy watched him work for a while. Heard what happened, he said eventually. Lucas kept his eyes on the wire. How? Linda Marsh called Margaret, who called Sue from the diner, who texted my wife. Roy paused. This is Harlow Creek, son. News moves faster than rain. Lucas pulled the wire taut and crimped it. It doesn't matter. It matters. Roy's voice was quiet but firm. He took the toothpick out of his mouth and looked at the field. That calf of his? It really was in the ditch. Yes. And you went in after it? Yes. Roy was quiet for a moment. You'd do something like that and get talked to like that in front of half the town. He shook his head slowly. That's not right, Lucas. I know it's not right. Lucas moved down the fence line to the next section. But Dale Whitford owns 1,100 acres and I own a cot and a pair of boots. Doesn't seem like there's a lot I can do about it. Roy Cassidy put the toothpick back in his mouth and didn't say anything else for a long while, but he was thinking. Lucas could tell by the way he chewed. Slow, steady, deliberate. The way a man chews when something has settled into him and he's deciding what to do with it. That evening, Lucas sat on the narrow porch of Mrs. Holloway's house and ate the sandwich she'd made him, turkey and mustard on white bread. The same thing she made every Friday, and watched the sky go from orange to purple to black over the fields. He was not the kind of young man who wallowed. His mother, Carol Merritt, had raised him in a small house in Wichita on a nurse's aide salary and the particular fierce pragmatism of a woman who knew that feeling sorry for yourself was a luxury she couldn't afford. He had inherited that from her, a tendency to face things straight on and then move forward. But tonight, the humiliation sat heavy. It wasn't the accusation itself. He knew what he'd done and why. It was the audience. It was the way Dale had turned to Bill Sutter to share the joke. It was the phrase, someone in your situation, deployed like a scalpel, designed to reduce him to a category rather than a person. He thought about the calf, its weight in his arms in the cold water, its heart beating against his chest. He wondered if it was doing all right. He almost laughed at himself for wondering. Mrs. Holloway pushed open the screen door and handed him a glass of sweet tea. She was a small woman with white hair kept in a tight bun and eyes that were sharper than most people gave her credit for. She had lived in Harlow Creek for 50 years. She had known Dale Whitford since he was a boy. She sat down in the other porch chair and folded her hands in her lap. You know, she said after a while, Dale Whitford's father, Robert, was a decent man, worked hard, treated people fair, left Dale that land free and clear. She paused. Sometimes I think that was the worst thing he could have done for him. Lucas looked at her. A man who earns what he has, she said carefully, usually understands what it costs. A man who inherits it She shook her head. Sometimes he just learns what it's worth. Lucas drank his sweet tea and thought about that for a long time after she went inside. The next morning was a Saturday, which in Harlow Creek meant the weekly farmers market that ran from 7 to noon in the parking lot behind the hardware store. It was the social and commercial center of the week, not just a place to buy vegetables and honey, but the place where deals were made, disputes were settled, and the community took its own temperature. Dale Whitford did not typically attend the farmers market himself. He was too large an operation for that. But he always had a table there, run by his housekeeper, Maria Delgado's teenage son, Eduardo, selling jarred preserves that Maria made and a selection of whatever produce the Whitford farm had in surplus. At 7:15 that Saturday morning, Roy Cassidy arrived at the farmer's market and set up his table. Sweet corn, early tomatoes, 2 varieties of squash, a basket of brown eggs. He arranged everything with his usual unhurried care. Then he put on his reading glasses, unfolded the Harlow Creek Gazette, and sat down in his camp chair. At 7:22, Frank DeLuca arrived with his wife, June. Frank ran the hardware store. He had been in that building, the one right next to the market, for 27 years. He walked past the Whitford table, looked at it for a moment, and kept walking. He bought 3 ears of corn from Roy and a jar of honey from the Barker twins' table and went back inside his store. At 7:40, Linda Chun, who owned the town's only pharmacy, came by with her daughter. She stopped at Roy's table, picked up a tomato, smelled it, put it in her basket. She glanced at the Whitford table. Eduardo Delgado, 17, sat there looking at his phone with the particular boredom of a teenager who would rather be anywhere else. Linda put a second tomato in her basket and moved on. By 9 o'clock, 6 people had walked past the Whitford table without stopping. This was unusual. Normally, Maria's preserves went fast. Eduardo had noticed. He sent a text to his mother. Maria Delgado had been working for the Whitford household for 11 years. She was a careful, private woman who kept her opinions about her employer locked away with the same discipline she brought to keeping his house immaculate. But she had grown up in Harlow Creek. She had been on Main Street yesterday morning. She had heard Dale's voice carrying down the block, and she had seen Lucas Merritt's face when he got back in that truck. She read Eduardo's text and set her phone down on the kitchen counter and stared at the wall for a moment. She did not reply. Roy Cassidy had not organized anything. He wanted to be clear on that point, at least in his own mind, because Roy was a man who believed in direct action and honest accounting. What happened that Saturday morning at the farmer's market, and what continued to happen in the days that followed, was not a plan. It was something more organic than that, and in some ways, more powerful. It was a feeling that moved through the town the way weather moves, not because anyone commanded it, but because the conditions were right. He did talk to some people. That evening after the market, he had a beer with Frank DeLuca at the bar inside. Patsy's Diner. They'd been doing that most Saturdays for 15 years, and they talked about what had happened on Main Street. Frank was not an emotional man. He ran his hardware store with the same dry precision he brought to everything. But he said something that Roy thought was exactly right. "A man can do what Dale did," Frank said, turning his beer glass in circles on the bar. "He can legally do it. He can say the kid was trespassing and be technically correct. But there's a difference between what a man is allowed to do and what a man ought to do." He paused, and this town has always known the difference. Roy nodded. "I'm not going to tell people what to do," Frank said. "But I'll tell you this. I've been supplying Dale Whitford's operation with hardware and equipment for 20 years. Fencing wire, replacement parts, irrigation components. He places a standing monthly order." He took a drink of his beer. "I think I might find that I'm out of stock for a while." Roy said nothing. He chewed his toothpick. "And the co-op," Frank continued. "I know Dale uses the grain co-op for storage and transport. I know 3 of the 5 people on that co-op board personally." He paused. "I'm not saying anything specific. I'm just observing." Roy finished his beer. "I'm not saying anything specific either," he said. "I'm just going to go home and make some phone calls." Lucas knew none of this was happening. He spent Saturday afternoon repairing a section of roof on Roy's equipment barn, replacing 3 rotted planks, resealing the ridge cap, working alone in the clean post-storm air with the focused satisfaction of physical work done properly. He was good with his hands. He was good at most things he put them to, which was part of what made his situation so persistently frustrating. Not a lack of ability, but a lack of access. In Harlow Creek, the land was everything, and the land was already owned. He drove back to Mrs. Holloway's in the early evening, cleaned up, ate the dinner she'd left covered on the stove, pot roast green beans, cornbread, and sat down with the paperback he'd been working through for 2 weeks. It was a novel about a man who builds a house from scratch in the mountains. Lucas had read it 3 times. He wasn't sure why he kept coming back to it. His phone buzzed at 8:15, a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. "Lucas," a woman's voice, low and careful. "This is Sandra Briggs, Carl's wife." He sat up straighter. Carl Briggs was Dale Whitford's ranch hand, the man who had allegedly seen Lucas on the property at 6 in the morning. The man whose witness account Dale had used to anchor his public accusation. "Mrs. Briggs," Lucas said carefully, "I want you to know something." Pause. He could hear her breathing, steadying, as though she'd rehearsed what she was about to say, and still needed to gather herself for it. "Carl didn't see you doing anything wrong. He came home Thursday morning and told me he'd found a calf in the shed, warm and alive in the burlap, and there were wet clothes on a nail. And he figured someone had pulled the animal out of the flooding. He said whoever did it probably saved its life." Another pause. He told Dale that, and Dale told him what to say if anyone asked. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "I'm not calling to cause trouble," Sandra said quickly. "Carl has to keep that job. We have 2 kids in school and the mortgage on this property, and Carl's been working for Dale for 8 years. I'm not asking you to do anything with this. I thought you should know that what Dale said on that street yesterday was a lie, and I couldn't let it stand without somebody knowing the truth." "I appreciate you telling me," Lucas said. "You're a good kid, Lucas." Her voice was tight. "I've seen you around town your whole life. You've never been anything but decent. A beat. I'm sorry this happened to you." After he hung up, Lucas sat with the phone in his hand for a long time. He stared at the wall. He thought about Carl Briggs, who had 8 years in and 2 kids in school and a mortgage, and who had been told to lie by the man who signed his checks. He thought about Sandra Briggs, who had made this phone call anyway because she couldn't let it stand. He put the phone down and picked up his book, but he didn't read any of it. By Monday morning, Harlow Creek was a different kind of quiet. Not the absence of sound quiet of early morning. A pointed quiet, the kind that has shape and intention. Dale Whitford's operation ran on a network of supply and service relationships that most people in town were woven into in one way or another. The grain co-op stored and transported his harvest. Frank DeLucas's hardware store supplied his fencing and irrigation materials. The mechanic at Harlow Creek Auto and Farm Service, a man named Bobby Teague, handled his combines and tractors. The 2 part-time workers who helped Carl Briggs during planting and harvest season, brothers named Luis and Marco Farinas, were hired through the informal labor network that Roy Cassidy and a few other small farmers effectively controlled. By Monday morning, Frank DeLuca had personally called Dale to inform him that his standing order of fencing components would be delayed. "Supply chain issues," he said with a flatness in his voice that said something else entirely. Bobby Teague had a sudden backlog of work that pushed Dale's scheduled combine maintenance to at least 3 weeks, maybe more. Luis and Marco Farinas had taken on other commitments for the next month. And at the grain co-op board meeting that Sunday afternoon, a meeting that had been scheduled for weeks for unrelated reasons, 3 of the 5 board members had raised questions about whether the co-op's contract with Whitford Farms needed to be reviewed. None of these were dramatic acts. None of them were individually devastating. But Dale, Whitford was a man who ran a large operation on tight margins and precise timing, as all large farming operations require, and each of these small withdrawals was a grain of sand pulled from the base of something heavy. He noticed, he made calls, he got polite, careful non-answers. He was not accustomed to non-answers. Lucas found out about it on Monday afternoon when he stopped at Patsy's diner for a coffee, and Patsy herself, Patricia "Patsy" Moreno, who had owned the diner for 30 years and knew everything about everyone, came out from behind the counter and sat down across from him in the booth. Patsy was 60 years old and built like a woman who had been carrying heavy plates and hard truths for decades. She had a silver cross at her throat and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular authority of someone who has fed a town long enough that the town trusts her with its stories. "You know what's going on, don't you?" she said. "I've heard some things," Lucas said carefully. "Frank, Roy, Bobby, the Farinas boys." She ticked them off on her fingers. "Half this town is pulling back from Dale. Not making noise about it, not calling the paper, just stepping away." Lucas looked at his coffee. "You didn't ask for this," Patsy said. "It was not a question." "No. Good." She paused, "because if you'd organized it, it would be a different thing. But this is people making their own choices." She folded her hands on the table. "I want you to understand something, Lucas. This town watched what Dale did to you on Friday morning. And this town has been watching Dale do smaller versions of that same thing for 20 years. To farmhands, to suppliers, to anyone he thought he could reduce." She shook her head slowly. "Friday was just the first time he did it in the middle of Main Street, out loud, to a kid who didn't deserve a single word of it." Lucas said nothing for a moment. "I don't want anyone to lose anything because of me," he said finally. "That's a decent thing to say." Patsy stood up. "But that's not your call to make." She went back behind the counter. Lucas sat with his coffee until it was cold and kept thinking about Carl Briggs and Sandra Briggs and an 80-pound calf in a flooding ditch, and all the ways a single moment can expand outward into something no one intended. Dale Whitford called Roy Cassidy on Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. Roy was in his kitchen eating oatmeal when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, set down his spoon, and answered. "Roy." Dale's voice was controlled, but Roy had known Dale Whitford for 35 years, and he could hear the pressure underneath the control, the particular tightness of a man who is used to being the one who makes calls, not receives them. "Dale," Roy said, "I want to talk about this situation." "What situation is that?" "A beat. Don't play with me, Roy. Frank DeLuca is suddenly out of stock. Bobby Teague has a backlog that didn't exist 2 weeks ago. The co-op board is talking about reviewing my contract." The pressure in his voice tightened another degree. "I know what this is, and I know it traces back to that Merritt kid. It traces back to what you did on Friday morning," Roy said quietly. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. "I was within my rights," Dale said. "The boy was on my property. He saved your calf, Dale. He was trespassing. He was 19 years old, wading into a flooded ditch in the middle of the night in a rainstorm." Roy's voice was still quiet, still even. "And you stood in the middle of Main Street and talked to him like he was a thief." "I have an operation to protect, Dale," Roy interrupted him, which was something he almost never did. "I've known you since we were both in grade school. I've watched you become exactly the kind of man your father never was. And I've kept my mouth shut about it for a long time because it wasn't my business." A pause. Friday morning, it became the town's business. The silence stretched again. "What do you want?" Dale's voice was stripped back now, flat. "I don't want anything," Roy said. "I can't speak for anyone else." He hung up. He sat at his kitchen table for a moment, looking at his oatmeal, then finished it. What Dale did not know yet, what no one had told him because no one had organized a communication strategy, because there was no organization here, just a current of feeling moving through a community, was that the situation had grown beyond hardware orders and combined maintenance. Sister Agnes Calloway, who ran the First Methodist Church's food pantry at the end of Main Street, had been supplying that pantry partly with produce from Whitford Farms for 4 years, a formal donation arrangement that gave Dale a modest tax benefit and a line in the church bulletin. On Monday, Sister Agnes had quietly notified Whitford Farms that the pantry would be seeking other suppliers. The Harlow Creek Elementary School principal, a woman named Diane Kowalski, had for 3 years accepted a small annual sponsorship from Whitford Farms for the school's agricultural education program, a few $100 that paid for supplies and a field trip to a working farm. On Tuesday morning, she sent a polite letter explaining that the school would be seeking other sponsors this year. These were small things, symbolic things. But in a town like Harlow Creek, where your name meant something, elementary school quietly distanced themselves from you was not small at all. Dale understood this. He understood it in his chest, in a place beneath strategy and justification, before he understood it in his head. Lucas Merritt, meanwhile, had a problem. On Tuesday afternoon, he received a message from Doane Pritchard, the county agricultural inspector who had been standing next to Dale on Friday morning. The message was formal, written in the particular colorless language of official communication, informing Lucas that a review of the labor arrangements on the 3 farms where he worked, Cassidy's, Henderson's, and the Barker place, was being initiated in response to questions about licensing and compliance. The message was technically neutral. The timing was not. Lucas read it twice, then drove to Roy's farm. Roy was in the equipment barn when Lucas arrived. He read the message, then looked up at Lucas with an expression that combined concern with something close to anger. "Pritchard," he said flatly. "Yes, Dale put him up to this. That's what it looks like." Roy set the phone down on the workbench. "This is harassment, plain and simple." "It might be. But if they open a compliance review, it costs you time and paperwork, and I know what it costs." Roy's voice was short, then he softened it. "I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about you." He looked at Lucas. "He's trying to cut you off. Take away the work." Lucas leaned against the doorframe. Outside, the afternoon was gold and heavy with heat. A single hawk turned lazy circles over the far field. "I've been thinking," Lucas said carefully, "that maybe I should go talk to him." Roy looked at him. "Dale," Lucas clarified. "Go out there and talk to him directly. Why would you do that?" "Because," Lucas paused, working through it, "because what's happening in this town isn't because of anything I did. It's what people chose to do on their own. And I don't want Carl Briggs to lose his job over it. And I don't want Maria Delgado to have trouble. And I don't want him pointing Pritchard at your operation because you were decent to me." Roy studied him for a long moment. "You know he won't apologize," Roy said. "You know that, right?" "Men like Dale, I'm not going for an apology," Lucas said. "I'm going to tell him that this ends, that he leaves the people alone who've been standing up because of what he did, that this is between him and me, not him and the whole town." A pause. "And that if he wants to use Pritchard to come after my work, you're not that kid," he said softly. Lucas looked at him. "The one he talked to on Friday," Roy said, "standing there with that bag of mineral supplement, taking it. You're already past that." Lucas said nothing. He didn't know if that was true yet. "All right," Roy said. "Go, but take your truck, not your feet. You show up at a man's door on foot, it reads his need. You show up in a vehicle, you're paying a call." Lucas almost smiled. "Yes, sir." Whitford Farms lay 2 miles east of town along Route 9. Down a private road marked by a white-painted wooden sign, Whitford Farms, Esta, 1962, flanked by 2 old oak trees that cast shadows across the entrance like hands folded in ceremony. Lucas drove in at 4:30 in the afternoon. The main house was a large 2-story white farmhouse, well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and window boxes full of red geraniums that Lucas's guessed were Maria Delgado's doing. The equipment sheds and grain storage buildings spread out behind it, substantial, precise, clearly the result of significant investment. The land itself was flat and wide and impossibly green in the late afternoon light, the corn already knee-high, the fields running to the horizon in straight dark rows. He parked in front of the house and got out. Carl Briggs appeared from around the corner of the main barn. He was a lean man in his 40s with a sunburned neck and careful eyes. He stopped when he saw Lucas. The two men looked at each other for a moment. "He's inside," Carl said finally. His voice was neutral, but his eyes said something else, something complicated, something that had to do with Sandra's phone call and what it had cost both of them. "Thank you," Lucas said. He walked up the porch steps and knocked on the door. Dale opened it himself, which Lucas had not expected. He'd half anticipated Maria, or being left to knock twice. But Dale opened the door almost immediately, as though he'd seen the truck coming up the road and had been waiting. He looked older up close than he did across the street. The certainty that had made him large at a distance had a different quality here. Tighter, more defended. "Merritt," he said. "Mr. Whitford. I'd like to talk to you if you have a few minutes." Dale held the door for a moment, then stepped back and gestured inside. Lucas wiped his boots on the mat and walked in. The interior of the house was what you would expect: heavy furniture, framed photographs of the land and livestock across multiple generations, a large stone fireplace in the living room, a kitchen that smelled of coffee, and something savory from dinner preparation. Nice things, but not ostentatious. The house of a man who thought of himself as a serious person, not a showy one. Dale led him to the kitchen table and sat down. He didn't offer coffee. Lucas didn't expect it. "Say what you came to say," Dale said. Lucas sat down across from him. He took a breath. "I came to tell you that I'm not the one who organized any of what's been happening in town," Lucas said. "I didn't ask anyone to pull back from your operation. I didn't talk to the co-op board or the school or the church pantry. People made their own choices about their own relationships with you." Dale's jaw was set. "But it started with you. It started with what you did on Friday morning," Lucas said, keeping his voice even. "I saved your animal. And you accused me of trespassing in front of half the town and implied I was there to steal. You used Carl's name to back it up." He paused. "Carl, whose wife called me on Saturday to tell me that what Carl actually told you was that someone had saved the calf and he didn't know who." Dale's expression shifted very slightly, a tightening round the eyes. "I'm not here to threaten you with that," Lucas said immediately. "Sandra called me because she couldn't let the lie stand. I understand that. I'm not going to use it to make your life harder unless you give me no other choice." "Then what do you want?" Dale's voice had the same flatness it had had on the phone with Roy, stripped of its performance, down to something more direct. "I want you to call off Pritchard," Lucas said. "The compliance review is aimed at Roy and Henderson and the Barkers because they've been decent to me, and that's not right. They don't deserve it. And in return—" "I don't have anything to offer you in return," Lucas said. "I'm 19 years old with a cot and a pair of boots. What I have is the truth about Friday morning, and I'll keep that between us as long as you leave those people alone." He paused. "What happens between you and the rest of this town, that's between you and them. I can't call that off, even if I wanted to. That's not mine to control." Dale was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table. He looked out the window at his fields, green and orderly in the late afternoon light. "You're not what I thought you were," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was simply an observation, delivered in the flat tone of a man confronting an unexpected fact. "No, sir," Lucas said. "I'm not." He stood up. He put his hands in his pockets. "One other thing," he said from the doorway. "Carl Briggs has given you 8 years of honest work. He's a good man in a hard situation. Whatever comes next for you and this farm, he deserves to be treated like that." He walked out. He drove home in the long golden light of a Kansas evening, his hand steady on the wheel, the fields passing on either side, green and endless and indifferent. The compliance review disappeared. Doan Pritchard's office sent a follow-up letter within 48 hours, a brief bureaucratic retraction citing insufficient basis to proceed, and that was the end of it. Roy Cassidy folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and said nothing about it to anyone except his wife. The rest of it did not disappear so quickly. Dale Whitford spent the following 2 weeks in the particular kind of isolation that is specific to small towns, not shunned dramatically, not confronted or protested, but simply and quietly excluded from the texture of daily life that he had previously taken as his right. People were polite when they encountered him. No one was hostile. But the easy warmth, the nods at the diner, the conversations at the feed store, the sense of belonging to a place that knows your name with affection, had been replaced by something careful and measured. He noticed it the way you noticed a draft in a room, not dramatically, but with a persistent chill that doesn't leave. Bill Sutter still worked for him and remained professionally loyal. But the lunches they'd shared at Patsy's Diner on Fridays had stopped, with no explanation given. The grain co-op contract was being reviewed, not canceled, but the process itself was a statement. The school sponsorship request he'd sent for the following year had received no response. Dale had, in the course of his life, made and lost business relationships. He had handled adversity. He was not a fragile man. But this was something different, and he knew it was different, and he spent considerable mental energy trying to identify exactly why. The answer, which arrived slowly during a sleepless night in the second week, was uncomfortable in its simplicity. He had done something wrong, and the community could see it, and all his justifications, the trespassing, the property rights, the implication of theft, had been visible to everyone as the performances they were. You could legally justify almost anything. The people of Harlow Creek had simply decided that legal and right were not the same thing, and they had acted accordingly. He sat in his kitchen at 2 in the morning and thought about Roy Cassidy's voice on the phone. "I've watched you become exactly the kind of man your father never was." Robert Whitford had been known, in the way that really good men are known, without ceremony or fanfare, just a quiet, consistent reputation built over decades of fair dealing and basic human decency. A handshake you could trust, a price you didn't have to argue. The kind of man who, if he saw a kid in trouble, helped first and asked questions later. Dale had thought for most of his adult life that having more of everything than his father had was the same as being more. He sat with the cold kitchen and the dark fields outside his window and understood, for the first time in a long while, that he had been wrong. Lucas was not thinking about Dale Whitford's nights. He was thinking about his own future, which had begun to look, for the first time in several years, like it might have dimensions he hadn't considered. The thing that had happened in Harlow Creek, the quiet solidarity, the way the town had simply stopped, had not made him famous. It had not generated news coverage or social media attention. This was not that kind of town, and this was not that kind of story. But it had made people see him differently. And in a community where your reputation was your infrastructure, that mattered. Roy Cassidy, on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the incident, had asked Lucas to come in and sit down at the kitchen table, not the workbench, the kitchen table, which meant a different kind of conversation. "I've been thinking," Roy said, in the manner of a man who has been thinking for a long time about the North 40. The North 40 was a parcel of Roy's land that had lain fallow for 3 years, too small to be economically viable on its own with Roy's equipment and operation, but good soil, well drained, with access to the irrigation line. "I'm not getting younger," Roy continued. "And Margaret keeps telling me I'm trying to work too much land for one man." A pause. "The North 40 could be leased out. Or," he looked at Lucas, "it could be worked by someone who knows what they're doing, on a share basis. 60-40. My land, my irrigation, my equipment, your labor, your management, your crop decisions." Lucas looked at him. "You'd take 60, Lucas said slowly. To start, the arrangement would review every year. Roy folded his hands on the table. You'd need seed money, maybe $3,000–4,000 to start properly. Lucas thought about his bank account. He thought about the $40 a week he paid Mrs. Holloway and the amount he'd been able to save over 2 years of 3 farm work. He thought about his mother in Wichita and the fact that he had never once asked her for anything. I can get there, he said. His voice was steady. Roy nodded. I figured. Frank DeLuca called 2 days later. He was looking for someone to help run the hardware store's delivery operation, not as a primary job, but as a reliable part-time arrangement 2 or 3 days a week. Because the kid he'd had doing it had gone off to college in September and hadn't been replaced. It's not glamorous, Frank said, with his characteristic flatness. I don't need glamorous, Lucas said. Good. Starts Monday. You know the store. You know the county roads. Pay is fair. Lucas added it up in his head. The delivery work, plus the share arrangement on Roy's North 40, plus the ongoing work for Henderson and the Barkers. It was not wealth. It was not security in the way that Dale Whitford understood security, with acres and combines and a name on a grain elevator. But it was a foundation. It was ground under his feet. He called his mother that evening. Carol Merritt answered on the second ring, the way she always did, as though she kept her phone within reach specifically for his calls, even though she'd never say so. Hey, Mom, Lucas. Her voice warmed immediately. What's going on? He told her. Not everything. He spared her the details of the public humiliation, because he knew she'd come up to Harlow Creek and say something to Dale Whitford that she'd probably regret. But he told her about the North 40 and Frank's delivery work and what it added up to. There was a silence on the line that he recognized as her collecting herself. Roy's a good man, she said finally. He is. You deserve this. Her voice was quiet and fierce in equal measure. You've been working your tail off for 2 years for other people's land. It's time you had something of your own. It's not mine. It's a lease. It's a start, she said. Same thing. He sat on Mrs. Holloway's porch after he hung up, the phone still warm in his hand. The August night heavy and full of insect sound and the smell of dry grass and distant fields. He was not a person given to large feelings expressed outwardly, but he sat there for a long time in the dark and let the moment be what it was. Carl Briggs found him at the feed store on a Thursday afternoon and fell into step beside him without preamble. Carl was not a man who wasted words or gestures. He walked in silence for a moment and Lucas let him. Sandra told me she called you, Carl said finally. Yes. Another silence. I want you to know that what Dale told me to say. Carl stopped, cleared his throat. I didn't say it. I mean, I was there that morning on Main Street. I heard what he said to you. But when people asked me after, I didn't back up the version he wanted. I just said I didn't know anything about it. Lucas looked at him. It wasn't enough, Carl said quietly. I know it wasn't enough. I should have. He stopped again. But I've got 2 kids, and you don't owe me an explanation, Carl, Lucas said. I think I do. Carl's voice had something in it, not quite guilt, but the weight of a man who has measured himself against a standard and come up short, and knows it. You pulled that calf out of a flooding ditch in the middle of the night and didn't ask for a single thing. And my boss stood there and called you a trespasser in front of the whole town. And he looked at the ground. I kept my head down. Lucas stopped walking. Carl stopped beside him. I know why you kept your head down, Lucas said. And I know what it cost you not to say what you knew. He paused. Sandra made her own choice. She called me because she couldn't let it stand. That was her decision. He looked at Carl directly. You're still here. You've still got your job. Your family's still okay. Your kids are in school. That's not nothing. That's what you were protecting. Carl looked at him. You're 19 years old, Carl said after a moment. Yes, sir. Carl shook his head slowly. He extended his hand. Lucas shook it. They parted ways in the parking lot without another word, and that was, in the way of men in that part of the world, enough. There was one conversation that Lucas had not had. and that he had been circling for 3 weeks without quite being able to approach. His relationship with the truth about Friday morning, Sandra's knowledge, the actual account of what Carl had found, the falseness of Dale's public accusation, was an asset. He knew that. Roy knew that. Frank DeLuca almost certainly guessed it. The question of what to do with it had been sitting at the edge of his thinking since the night Sandra called. He had told Dale he would keep it between them as long as Dale left Roy and the others alone. Dale had honored that. The compliance review had been pulled. No further moves had been made. The deal, such as it was holding. But there was another dimension to it that Lucas hadn't fully addressed. Even in his own thinking, he had been publicly accused. In the middle of Main Street, in front of people who knew him, by the most powerful man in the county. The accusation, trespassing, someone in your situation, any opportunity that presents itself, had been heard by every person on that block and had since spread through the town through the relay of small community communication until everyone in Harlow Creek knew the broad strokes of what had happened. What they didn't know, what only he and Carl and Sandra and Dale knew, was that the factual foundation of that accusation had been constructed from a lie. Lucas sat with this question for a long time. He sat with it in the truck on his drives between farms. He sat with it on the porch in the evenings. He sat with it in Roy's North 40, walking the rows of the soil he was learning to think of as his responsibility, the late August sun warm on his back. He thought about what his mother would say. He thought about what Roy had said, "You're already past that, kid." He thought about what Patsy had said, "That's not your call to make." He thought about what Mrs. Holloway had said, "A man who inherits sometimes just learns what it's worth." He thought about Carl Briggs shaking his hand in a parking lot. He thought about an 80-pound calf shaking in the rain, its heart against his chest, and he made a decision. The annual Harlow Creek Harvest Community Dinner was held on the last Saturday of August, in the park behind the Methodist Church, a tradition that went back 40 years. Organized by a rotating committee of town residents and funded by a combination of individual donations and small business sponsorships. Long tables were set up in the park, covered with white paper tablecloths. People brought covered dishes. The Barker twins always brought 3 pies. Roy Cassidy always brought sweet corn, roasted in the husk. There was a bluegrass band on a small stage, and the evening went on until the fireflies came out, and the children fell asleep in lawn chairs. It was the most attended single event of the year in Harlow Creek. Everyone came. Lucas had not planned anything for the evening. He had simply planned to attend, eat Roy's corn, and exist in the community that had shown itself over the previous weeks to have both memory and conscience. He was at Roy and Margaret's table with Frank and June DeLuca and Patsy Marino and old Gerald Marsh when Dale Whitford arrived. This was not, strictly speaking, unusual. Dale had attended the harvest dinner for as long as anyone could remember, and a man would have to be very determined in his shame to stop attending his own town's central community event. But there was a particular quality to his arrival. He came alone, without Bill Sutter, without the usual performance of arriving, as though the evening had been waiting for him. He got a plate of food at the serving table and found a place to sit. Not at the long center table where he would normally have positioned himself, but at a smaller table near the edge of the park. Maria Delgado, who was seated with her family 3 tables over, watched him for a moment. She looked at her husband. She did not say anything. Lucas watched too. He watched without drama, without intensity, the way you watch something that has not yet resolved into what it's going to be. It was Margaret Cassidy, Roy's wife, a woman of extraordinary social intuition, who did what she did next. She stood up from the table, took her plate and her sweet tea, walked across the park to the small table where Dale sat alone, and sat down across from him. Roy watched this happen with an expression Lucas couldn't quite read. "She does that," Roy said quietly, more to himself than to anyone. "What?" Lucas asked. "Reminds people they're still here." Roy paused. "Even when they probably wish she wouldn't." Lucas did not speak to Dale that evening. He was not ready for that, and he did not think Dale was either. Some things take longer than 3 weeks. What he did at the end of the night, when the band had finished and the tables were being folded and people were gathering covered dishes and children and lawn chairs, was walk to the edge of the park where the old oak trees stood in the dark and where he had a clear view east, toward Route 9, toward the road that led to Whitford Farms, and beyond it to the horizon. Roy found him there. They stood together in the comfortable silence of two people who have worked alongside each other and have nothing left to prove. "You going to be all right?" Roy asked. "Yes," Lucas said, and he meant it completely. "North 40's going to need prep work starting next week," Roy said. "Soil testing, drainage assessment, long days. I know, you're not afraid of long days." "No." Roy was quiet for a moment. The fireflies were coming out across the field, their cold green light drifting through the dark. "You want to know something I've never told anyone?" Roy said. Lucas looked at him. "When I was 22, Roy said, I had a chance to buy 60 acres east of town. Good land, good price. I didn't have the money, and I was too proud to ask anyone for help, and I told myself I'd find another opportunity." He paused. "I've been working other people's land, in one form or another, ever since." He looked at the field. "The North 40 is the right thing. But I also want you to know there are going to be other opportunities. And when they come, you're allowed to ask for help. That's not weakness. That's how the world works for people who don't start with everything." Lucas felt the words land somewhere deep, not painfully, but with weight. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Roy clapped him once on the shoulder and went to help Margaret fold tables. The following week, Lucas began work on the North 40. The soil testing came back good, slightly low in nitrogen, correctable with the right amendments. The drainage was adequate, with one section near the eastern fence that would need a small improvement before planting. Lucas mapped everything carefully on graph paper, consulted 3 sources, and wrote out a crop plan for the season. He also had a conversation with Sandra Briggs. He called her on a Monday evening and thanked her for her call, and told her that the situation with Pritchard had resolved. He told her that Carl's job appeared to be secure. He told her that he had spoken to Dale, and that Dale had understood what needed to be said. She was quiet for a moment. "Did he apologize?" she asked. "Not in words," Lucas said, "but I think he's working toward it." "That's more than I expected," she said honestly. "Me too," Lucas admitted. The apology, when it came, was not a scene. It was not public, it was not dramatic, and it did not come with a speech. It came on a Wednesday morning in early September, when Dale Whitford drove his truck to Roy Cassidy's farm, walked to the North 40 where Lucas was working, and stood at the edge of the field for a moment before speaking. Lucas looked up from the soil amendment he was working into the eastern section. Dale was wearing work clothes, not the pressed shirt and clean jacket of his Main Street appearance, but actual work clothes broken in, with dirt already on the knees. Lucas noticed this without commenting on it. "I owe you a word," Dale said. Lucas straightened up. "What I said to you on Main Street was wrong." Dale's voice was controlled and precise, the way a man's voice is when he has rehearsed something and is determined to get through it. "You were on my property because you were doing the right thing. Carl told me the truth about what he found, and I chose to use it another way for reasons that—" A pause. He looked at the field. "I've been asking myself for 3 weeks what those reasons were, and I don't have a good answer. I have a familiar one, that I was protecting my property, my reputation, my operation. But familiar isn't the same as good." He looked back at Lucas. "You were 19 years old in a flooding ditch in the middle of the night, saving an animal that wasn't yours. And I stood on a public street and tried to make you look small for it." Lucas held the man's gaze. "I was wrong," Dale said. "I'm sorry." The words were plain. They were not decorated with excuses or softened with qualifications. They were simply the truth, offered straight, the way a man offers something when he finally stops calculating what it costs him. Lucas looked at him for a long moment. The morning was quiet around them, the sound of birds in the tree line, the distant hum of Roy's tractor somewhere on the south side of the property, the warm weight of early September sun on the turned earth. "I accept that," Lucas said. Dale nodded. He looked at the field, at the amended soil, the staked rows, the careful work of someone who had spent real time studying what the land needed. "You're doing this right," Dale said. "Not as a compliment exactly, as an observation. The observation of a man who knows farming and recognizes it being done properly. I'm trying to," Lucas said. Dale looked at him one more time. There was something in his expression that was hard to name, not quite remorse, not quite respect, but something in the territory between them. A reckoning with the distance between the man he had been and the man he was slowly, painfully trying to become. He turned and walked back toward his truck. He drove away without looking back. Lucas stood in the field for a moment, the soil amendment in his hands, the morning spreading wide and clean around him. He thought about what Roy had said the night of the harvest dinner. There are going to be other opportunities, and when they come, you're allowed to ask for help. He thought about his mother's voice. "It's a start." Same thing. He thought about the weight of a calf in a flooding ditch, its heart beating too fast, its legs scrabbling for ground. He thought about the moment he found ground for both of them. By the time the first frost came to Harlow Creek in late October, Lucas Merritt had 40 acres in preparation for spring planting, a part-time delivery arrangement with Frank DeLucas's hardware store that was slowly becoming something closer to full-time, and a room at Mrs. Holloway's that she had told him, with characteristic directness, he could keep as long as he needed it at the same $40 a week, which they both understood was not a market rate but an act of faith. The town did not go back to the way it had been with Dale Whitford, not entirely, not immediately. Trust, once withdrawn, returns on its own schedule, and the people of Harlow Creek were not people who forgot things, but there were small movements in the right direction. Margaret Cassidy's act of sitting down at his table had opened something. A few people followed her lead over the following weeks, not with drama or declaration, but in the ordinary ways of community. A nod at the feed store, a conversation at the post office, the slow restoration of the basic courtesies that hold a town together. Dale, for his part, did not make grand gestures. He did not take out an ad in the Gazette or stand on Main Street and make a speech. He simply went about his work, his 1,100 acres, his combines, his grain elevator with its name 3 feet high, with somewhat less of the performance that had always attended it. People noticed. In a town like Harlow Creek, they always noticed. He rehired Luis and Marco Farinas for the fall harvest, and this time he paid them correctly the first time, without the usual back and forth that Carl had always dreaded. He did not call the compliance inspector again. On the last evening of October, Lucas drove out to the Whitford property. Not to the house, he didn't go to the door. He drove along Route 9 until he could see the south pasture, and he parked on the shoulder of the road and sat there for a moment in the dark truck. He could see cattle moving in the far pasture in the cold blue dark, their breath visible in the October air. He looked for a long time. He found the black and white one eventually. It was larger now, still young, still a little unsteady at the legs in the way of young cattle, but alive and solid and moving with the others across the frost-touched grass. Lucas watched it for a moment. Then he put the truck in gear and drove home. The calf did not know what it owed him. The land did not know what he intended. But the town of Harlow Creek knew both, and in the long memory of a place that measures a man not by what he owns, but by what he does when no one is watching, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.